Hello and welcome. I'm Michael Scott. Thank you for joining me for this second event on our new series titled The Christian Literary Imagination. This follows on from last year's series, Christian Shakespeare ? And as with that series, it's sponsored by Georgetown University, Washington, DC, in association with the Las Casas Institute for Human Dignity at Blackfriars Hall, the University of Oxford. Today, I will be welcoming Dr. Peter Davidson, who will be talking about the poet Saint Robert Southwell. I will take questions from members of our audience, which is an internationally based one. We have over 100 registered for today's discussion. We encourage you, please, to participate by typing in your questions directly to us from the moment we begin today's session. You can do so by using your Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question, please ask it, and we will endeavour to answer it or them either today or later by email. The series is part of a larger project, The Future of the Humanities, promoted by the Las Casas Institute, Blackfriars, and Georgetown University's Humanities Initiative. The aim of the project is to explore, through a series of high-profile events, conferences, lectures, talks, seminars, and symposia, the place of the arts and humanities in continuing to develop an understanding of human life, dignity, equality, and culture. Amongst our speakers this year are Peter Davidson today, Michael Collins, Molly Clark, John Drakakis, Claire Broom-Saunders, Mark Bosco, Noel Sugimara, Paul Edmondson, Bridget Keegan, Jane Stevenson. My joint convener for the series is Joseph Simmons, SJ, who is currently studying at Campion Hall, Oxford. For those who don't know me, I'm a Senior Dean and Fellow at Blackfriars Hall and Director of the Future of the Humanities Project and Senior Advisor to the President at Georgetown University. So to today's speaker. Peter Davidson, who was formerly Regius Professor of English at the University of Aberdeen, Scotland, is now with Campion Hall in Oxford, where he also teaches English and art history at Jesus College. He read for his first degree at Cambridge and then his MA at York before returning to Cambridge to read for his doctorate. He taught in Leiden in Holland, St Andrews and Warwick Universities before Aberdeen, and has now settled in Oxford, where in addition to his principal teaching and research, his interests extend to writing on places and nature. This has led to a number of books, including The Idea of North and The Last of Light. As if this were not enough, he takes care of the extensive art collection, and wonderful collection it is, at Campion Hall. His publications are legion, but in respect of today's talk, I'd particularly like to mention that he is the general editor of the 5-volume Oxford University Press edition of the complete works of Saint Robert Southwell, about whom we are delighted he has chosen to speak. So without any more from me, over to you, Peter.
Thank you. It seems strange to have to remind ourselves about the life and writings of an English poet as important and as influential as Robert Southwell. Father Robert Southwell of the Society of Jesus, Saint Robert Southwell, martyr, whose feast is commemorated on the 21st of February. Why this neglect, particularly when Southwell's verses, shorn of the most obvious Catholic references and printed openly at London, outsold almost all other poetry in the 20 or 30 years after his martyrdom in 1595? These verses are of compelling quality and originality. Their influence on the next generation of writers in English is ubiquitous and unquestionable. Yet, if you are looking to buy Southwell's works today, you will either have to seek out an out-of-print Oxford edition of the English verse from 50 years ago, or buy from a small press the paperback of the English and Latin verse, which I edited with the late and much missed Anne Sweeney. even Southwell's most brilliant and most influential prose, despite the advocacy of such distinguished contemporaries as the late Sir Geoffrey Hill, is out of print altogether. Why this neglect? Why does almost everybody, including so many people who should know better, continue to write of the imaginative innovations of English metaphysical poets, rather than writing, actually considerably more accurately, of English Baroque poetry of the school of Southwell? There is one simple answer, I think. At the precise point in the 1920s, when English literature emerged as a university subject, a horribly influential critic, Sir Herbert Grierson, in his perniciously influential volume, The Metaphysical Poets, excluded Southwell forever from the English canon on the simple grounds that, being a Roman Catholic, he was not English enough to merit inclusion or study. And as Grierson wrote, I quote, "Southwell wrote in the manner of the Italians." And what Southwell wrote was, I quote again, confectionery or fireworks, but it was not English poetry. According to Grierson, Donne, you will be relieved to hear, became a proper English poet when he ceased to be a Catholic. Now, the trouble is that this pernicious nonsense somehow seeped into the intellectual water table and has invisibly influenced innumerable anthologies, histories, and literature courses, so that all that is truly current of Southwell's, even amongst really well-read people, are a couple of Christmas poems, the ever delightful Burning Babe, and that part of A Child My Choice, which was set to music by Britten in his Ceremony of Carols. Now, things are perhaps changing in that I am now one of the general editors of an Oxford University Press edition of Southwell's complete works. Now, given the troubled history of the British Roman Catholic community since Southwell's death in 1595, the manuscript sources for Southwell's still unedited texts are still scattered across the former Papal and Habsburg territories, or are found amongst the papers and institutions of the old Catholic community in England, mostly now at Stonyhurst in Lancashire. The edition may, accordingly, take us some time. But today, I should like to lay before you a few examples of how Southwell brought the riches of Jesuit meditation and of Roman Baroque art into the imaginative repertory of English poetry. But first, it might be sensible simply to recapitulate who Southwell was and what he wrote. Before I do so, I feel I ought to emphasize that so much of what I have to say was formulated in conversation with the late Anne Sweeney in those 2 most productive years which preceded her untimely death, that I feel that I am, to an extent, really speaking for both of us, not for myself alone. So, Robert Southwell was born in the winter of 1561-1562, the son of a Norfolk knight, Sir Richard Southwell. His mother, Bridget Copley, maintained her faith and her Catholic connections. On the 10th of June, 1576, with his father in prison for speaking against the Queen, the 14-year-old Southwell arrived in Flanders, lodging at William Allen's English College at Douai. His education from this point became very different from that available in any English school or university. He was at the brilliant leading edge of the Counter-Reformation. Jesuit educational practices were innovative and had an unusual emphasis on the arts. The boys wrote and acted in plays, usually in Latin. Southwell's Poema di Assunzione Beate Mariae Virginis, his Latin poem on the Assumption of the Virgin, has the controversialist tone, visual imagination, and linguistic virtuosity of such college productions. Southwell made his way to Rome, entering the Jesuit novitiate there in 1579. He became prefect of studies and prefect of the Sodality of the Blessed Virgin at the Venerable English College, where manuscripts of some of his early works remain to this day. Southwell was ordained priest in 1584. Now, one of his known roles at the English College was to engage continental Catholics with sending out reports of the oppression of their English co-religionists. Elizabeth's close advisor, Cecil, consequently blamed Southwell for bringing England into disrepute in Europe. And when Southwell persuaded Father General Claudio Acquaviva to spare him for England, arriving there in July 1586, Cecil was already working to catch him and to silence his pen. It is significant that one of the earliest texts of Southwell's exquisite memorial poem for Mary Queen of Scots, a poem called Decease, Release, a poem which was obviously excluded from the printed editions of his verses, is today in Lambeth Palace Library, the library of the Anglican Archbishop of Canterbury, having been intercepted by a kinsman of Cecil's as seditious writing shortly after Mary Queen of Scots' death. So in London, Southwell became attached to the household of Anne Dacres, wife to Philip Howard, Earl of Arundel, one of the foremost noblemen in the country, who was then imprisoned for his professed Catholicism. Southwell ministered to the Earl by written communication alone, but his exemplary predicament was addressed as part of a communication with Southwell's wider congregation. In 1595, Southwell died on the scaffold for the religion which these poems embody. The Catholic Church remembers him as a martyr on the 21st of February each year. But, and this is a large and important but, without Southwell's corpus of poetry, written in hiding to sustain the adherents of an illegal religion, distributed in uncensored text only in secret, it is hard to see how such established and canonical poets as Donne, Herbert, and Milton could have developed English poetry as they did. So much of the imaginative framework, the visualized scenes and emblems, the grand imaginations of the cosmos, which distinguish early modern English poetry, are Southwellian inventions, Southwellian imitations, and Southwellian importations. Southwell's most extensive poem, St. Peter's Complaint, is a much varied imitation of an Italian original by Tanzillo. Southwell's Peter is a biblical character, as it were ventriloquized, to speak as a contemporary man, albeit an exceptionally eloquent contemporary man, with contemporary English preoccupations concerning treason and apostasy, preoccupations which shadow Peter's movement through despair to repentance and reconciliation. The dialect and details in the poem tie his monologue into English affairs of the 1580s and 1590s, with a comprehensive sweep of imaginative analogy to new to English poetry. What we have here is a wholehearted application of a biblical episode to the fears and the feelings of an early modern subject, a flawless parallelism sustained through a virtuosic, metamorphic flow of Baroque imagery, including glimmering passages on the eloquence of tears, for the length of an extended verse running to nearly 800 lines. Now, selective quotation is vain, but consider just how much is evoked, how much is circumscribed, evoked by the one astonishing line, Lazar at pity's gate, I ulcered lie. Lazar at pity's gate, I ulcered lie. Or by the lacerating knowledge and self-knowledge and evocation of English traditional belief in this one line addressed to Christ, be thou thyself, though changeling I offend. Be thou thyself, though changeling I offend. This imaginative parallelism found also extensively developed in many of the English college plays written under Jesuit auspices, was only one part of the new energizing of the arts that flowered after the mid-century councils of Trent, an energy which Southwell quite simply imported to England. Now, literary history has tended to suppress this importation, emphasizing instead England's vernacular Sidneyism or the Shakespearean Golden Age. But in time, Southwell's innovative mix of psychological integrity, highly visual imagery, and high emotion percolated into every literary corner. It is worth remembering that it was in Southwell's St. Peter and in his related prose poem and sacred meditation, Mary Magdalene's Funeral Tears, that this rich new poetic first appeared in Fool in England. Where did he find all these wonderful things which he imported into his poetry and thus into the English literary imagination? Well, his poetry is founded on his Jesuit training, most specifically on the spiritual exercises to which he is remarkably faithful in process and intention. It is enriched by the realized visions bodied forth on the walls of the churches in which Southwell served and worshipped in Rome. The original Jesuit vision of Christianity was one of practical chivalric duty, fealty to the Lord, reconciliation with enemies, protection of the weak. Each new dramatic production, poem, or series of paintings in Jesuit colleges and churches enlarged upon this personal commitment and engagement. We now know, as the archives and papers of the Venerable English College in Rome are conserved and catalogued, that several of Southwell's earlier compositions in both prose and verse are still there, in their original groupings as records of oratory, declamation, and Latin poetry composed by students. In their turn, Southwell's English lyrics imported into England word paintings of the eloquent beauty of the painted walls and ceilings which he had seen in Rome. Now, let us look at two English poems in a little more detail. Sip of water. The first poem is Christ's Bloody Sweat, a developed meditation on the agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, entered into the chief Catholic and therefore secret manuscript of Southwell's work in the early 1590s. So in the early 1590s, we know this text existed and it was written into what's called the Waldegrave manuscript, now at Stonyhurst College, which is the kind of leading secretly circulated Catholic manuscript of Southwell. Now, it was printed with St. Peter's Complaint and with Southwell's most obviously Catholic poems omitted in 1595 in London. So let me read it to you, and I will read the first verse twice because we have here a delightful Baroque conceit in that the first four lines form a kind of magic square. Full soil, full spring, sweet olive, grape of bliss, that yields, that streams, that pours, that does distill, untilled, undrawn, unstamped, untouched of press, dear fruit, clear brooks, fair oil, sweet wine at will. Thus Christ unforced prevents in shedding blood the whips, the thorns, the nails, the spear and rood. But because it is a magic square, I've just read it horizontally, but now I'm going to read it vertically. Fat soil that yields untilled dear fruit, full spring that streams undrawn clear brooks, sweet olive that pours unstamped fair oil, grape of bliss that does distill, untouched of press, sweet wine at will. Thus Christ unforced prevents in shedding blood the whips, the thorns, the nails, the spear and rood. He pelicans, he phoenix fate does prove, whom flames consume, whom streams enforce to die. How burneth blood, how bleedeth burning love, can one in flame and stream both bathe and fry? How could he join a phoenix fiery pains in fainting pelicans' still bleeding veins? Elias once, to prove God's sovereign power, by prayer procured a fire of wondrous force, that blood and wood and water did devour, yea, stones and dust beyond all nature's course. Such fire is love, that fed with glory blood, doth burn no less than in the driest wood. O sacred fire, come show thy force on me, that sacrifice to Christ I may return. If withered wood for fuel fittest be, if stones and dust, if flesh and blood will burn, I withered am, and stony to all good, a sack of dust, a mass of flesh and blood. Now, in that magic square, the lines read horizontally and vertically at the beginning, Southwell presents a metaphoric miracle, the paradoxical combination of liquid and flame into one substance, through Christ's redemptive act of self-sacrifice as prefigured by the agony in the garden. Then Southwell plays on the emblematic attribute of the pelican's self-sacrificial love for its young, its drawing blood from its own breast to feed them. Then follows the phoenix's glorious singular ability to die in flames and rise again. He stresses paradoxical rather than linear relationships, constantly breaking up the order of the substances so neatly presented in the first verse. Now, line 9 sees two substances rendered problematic. Blood cannot burn in nature. A burning thing cannot also stream with blood. So solve it, Southwell seems to say. And line 10 reverses the order yet again, repeating the problem, but bringing the two ends of the paradox closer to the single solution of the puzzle. Can one inflame and stream, both bathe and fry? Southwell in the last couplet particularizes one into he, to bring the solution to his acrostic paradoxical puzzle even closer to the reader's mind. He takes his reader back to the Old Testament, first to clear the way to the solution of this glorious, sacred, mysterious riddle. Elias' miraculous fire, procured to prove God's sovereign power, was capable of devouring blood and water as well as wood. Indeed, it consumed the very stones. And this provides Southwell with both the type and the nature of the answer. Such fire is love, the burning love fed by Christ's blood willingly given. It is a love poem, unlikely as it seems. True love, exemplified not by poetic fancies, but by Christ's self-sacrifice, is capable of burning up a body of flesh and blood as if it were one dry twig, both metaphorically, as a love poet meant it, and actually, as a Catholic mission priest in late Elizabethan England might mean it. Now, this poem would have been recognized by contemporaries both as a kind of supra-Petrarchan love poem from the Christian soul and a divine meditation in the form of, let's use the word for once, a metaphysical acrostic. But it does not stop at that. It is another demonstration of Southwell's onion skin, multi-layered creativity. On closer inspection, the first stanza seems different from the rest. There is that acrostic magic, and it names Christ specifically. But the second introduces a completely new element, fire, alongside an exaltation that has now lost any reference to oil or sweat and is exclusively about gory blood. Now, who exactly is this he in the second stanza, whom flames consume, whom streams enforce to die? Now, to a mind now distant from the events of the 1580s and 90s, it seems very easy to reply, well, why Christ? But to a community still stunned by the butchering and burning of Edmund Campion's body, it may have had another resonance altogether. Southwell's word prevents is not forestalls. In context, it is the Latin prevenire. It is to proceed, to anticipate. The sacred fire that is invoked in the last stanza begins to meet the flames of Southwell's famous poem, The Burning Babe, where love is the fire and sighs the smoke, the ashes, shame and scorns, and the fuel is laid on by justice and by mercy, mercy who blows the coals. And all of this, yes, all of this is the Lexis of Tyburn as much as of Calvary. Like St. Peter's complaint, what we have here is an almost miraculously sustained parallel, the biblical event shadowed prospectively and retrospectively by contemporary English reality. Now let's just look last at a few verses of Decease Release, Southwell's calmly beautiful but dangerous meditation on the death of Mary Queen of Scots. The pounded spice both taste and scent doth please, in fading smoke the force does incense show, the perished kernel springeth with increase, the lopped tree does best and soonest grow. God's spice I was, and pounding was my due, in fading breath my incense savoured best. Death was the means my kernel to renew, by lopping shot I up to heavenly rest. Alive a queen, now dead I am a saint. Once Mary called, my name now martyr is. From earthly reign debarred by restraint, in lieu whereof I reign in heavenly bliss. Rue not my death, rejoice at my repose. It was no death to me, but to my woe. The bud was open to let out the rose, the chains unloosed to let the captive go. Well, let's consider the motto first, so like the emblem mottos on the elusive political needleworks which Mary Stuart worked in her captivity. Dum morior orior, dying I rise, dying I arise. This sets the tone for a seditious celebration of the death of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, executed by order of Elizabeth on the 8th of February, 1587. This was after many years of imprisonment in England, during which Mary had, at the very least, been aware of Catholic plots against her cousin. This poem never saw print, obviously, in the early modern period, and its very presence in such a manuscript as the Stonyhurst manuscript, known as the Waldegrove manuscript, makes ownership and circulation the very possession of that copied text of Southwell into a flirtation with treason. The series of speaking pictures expressing the nature of a martyr's death, which opens this poem, relate closely to images from contemporary books of emblems, ubiquitous artifacts composed of an enigmatic picture, a motto, and an explanation relating motto to picture. Now, emblems became a central part of Jesuit education in the figures, the imagery of poetry. There are many Jesuit emblem books, some of them actually international bestsellers. Jesuit colleges exhibited emblems on prize days. The emblem images which are used in this poem are mostly ones which Mary Stuart herself had used in that series of symbolic, politically charged embroidered panels which she had made in the years of her captivity. And yet, the calm authority of the imagined voice of the martyr speaking from the threshold of, the martyr speaking from the threshold of heaven is something which goes absolutely beyond the violence of Tudor politics. The ordering of the emblem images is transformative. The accretion of regrowth and rebirth adds up to something of great serenity and beauty, born all right out of worldly intrigue and suffering, but a voice from heaven speaking of the potential of utter human transformation. So to conclude, the significance of Southwell's poetic vision, the visions and imaginations which he brought into English verse, spreads far beyond his immediate pastoral intention. His attempts to reproduce the effective impact of the early Baroque visual arts of the continent in English or Latin imagery and evocation are the beginning of a specific tradition in English poetry, which later shaped and informed the writing of Donne, Herbert, and Milton. Extraordinarily and unbelievable as it seems in retrospect, at the time of Southwell's canonization, that is in my own lifetime, questions were asked in the British Parliament as to whether the authorities could permit this action of papal aggression, this act of making saints of traitors. Now, in the light of this, it is perhaps hardly surprising that mainstream Anglophone criticism, perhaps simply unsure how to approach this gentle Catholic martyr and saint, perhaps stumbling on his Catholicism alone, has tended to hurry over Southwell's complex, imaginative, beautiful verse. It notices him if he appears in the canon at all, in the generation of religious poets who preceded that insular divisive fiction, metaphysical poetry. Now, this is the inversion of the truth, and it now needs to be reconsidered and, dare I hope, corrected. Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you so much for such a lovely talk, and especially can I thank you for the way that you read the poems. You read them so beautifully, and with such tender care, I felt, and so it's been a delight just sitting here listening to you. Could I just ask you a few questions now that are coming through, and can I just say to people who are watching, if you have a question, please do send them through over the next 20 minutes or so. You do mention the European influence on Southwell and on Southwell's poetry. I just wonder whether there is any native influence, any influence that's coming also from medieval poetry.
That is a wonderful question, because in fact Southwell's education is pretty well all continental. So one wonders what he brought to his poetry from the first years of his life, where he was in I think a fairly traditional community in Norfolk. I mean, rather interestingly, perhaps through the influence of his mother, it's one of the very few Norfolk churches where no one's done anything to the images on the roof screen in Hortense and Faith. And I think that what he brought to that is that we actually have in one of the Stonyhouse manuscripts what seems to be the very first draft of a version of St. Peter's Complaint. And it's drafted, I think, just before he leaves Rome, 1580s, maybe 1580s. I think it's that period, that paper. And he's really trying to relearn his English. And as he does so, I think he turns in some of the lines that he's trying out, but then in some of his mature poems as well, to the meter of English ballad, so that there is a kind of pulse and simple versification in some of his poems, however complex the content, which speaks of the songs he heard round the fire when he was a child, and a tradition of popular English poetry, particularly popular devotional poetry, that just stretches back seamlessly into the Middle Ages.
Thank you for that. It's just reading Deceased Release. The word woeful comes, and it just reminded me of a poem I read last week, Woefully Arrayed.
Yes.
A medieval age. It was just the meter, the image that's coming through, and it's so poignant because although he's talking of Mary Queen of Scots all the time now, you're thinking that this is also about himself.
Yes,
what's going to happen
that's
to him.
Something very brave and very delicately handled in all that poetry he wrote in England, because it is, in a sense, inevitable that when he is writing of martyrdom, he's shadowing himself.
Absolutely.
And he's, particularly when he's thinking about St. Philip Howard in the Tower in prison, I die without desert, that he's thinking of his own condition. Of course, he addresses his co-religionists in the Epistle of Comfort, one of his prose works, which we are going to, we're obviously including in this new edition, that he is drawing these instances, these ideas of how he lives his daily life, how they live their daily life in this kind of shadow, in this sort of absolute winter.
Absolutely.
And so he's very conscious that he is there in the poem. I mean, he is the good Jesuit meditating through so much of his work.
Let me go to a question that's come in from Catherine Temple, actually. Do you think the suppression of his poetry during his lifetime impacted his reputation and reduced the recognition he should have received?
Well, this is a very strange question, because actually the number of his poems that were suppressed during his lifetime is maybe half a dozen of the most overtly Catholic ones, Eucharistic and Marian, and of course the two treason poems. But actually the vast bulk of his poetry was a smash hit. It sold in more editions, I think, than any other single poetic text except Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis. And it ran Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis actually very close. So, shorn of these overtly sort of Catholic poems, the generally Christian run of Southwell's poetry was very, very widely received, extremely popular. We know that all sorts of people, like the Calvinist Marquis of Montrose in the 1630s, had half of Southwell. His book still survives. He had the little edition. It's now in the Inner Periphery Library. He refers to it in his own verses. In some senses, what I think is mysterious is the complete disappearing act from university English. That, you have this poet who's so obviously very widely distributed. His work is it displays those individualities that are so much prized in the work of Donne. And yet, when we come to have university English courses, he simply disappears.
Well, Joe Simmons, my co-convener, says that. Do you think he will will ever reach the level of familiarity as fellow Jesuit Gerard Manley Hopkins?
That's a very interesting question, because actually, it looked at first as if Hopkins's verse would remain in a very small, very select group of people who'd known him and a few of his Jesuit friends and brothers. But actually, what really started Hopkins's verse on its journey into, I think, being very widely known was university English. That Hopkins was thought in the 1920s, when university English degrees were starting, he presented the kind of depth of linguistic exploration. He presented the kind of rhythmic innovation and individuality that was very much valued. I mean, he was greatly valued as a precursor of modernism, which produces an absolutely extraordinary publication phenomenon. That I know this from somebody who taught me, who was one of the first English students at Cambridge, and they copied Hopkins out by hand. There was perhaps one copy of Robert Bridges' memorial volume, and that you had many people making manuscript copies of Hopkins. So there's half the question, that in a sense Hopkins, found a much wider readership through university English. I don't know. It seems to me very odd. I mean, that another of my old tutors, Peter Croft, published the works of Philip Sidney's extremely talented brother about 30 years ago, and they've just never made it into the canon. I mean, that these are poems from the absolute epicenter of the Sidney Circle, their beautiful Petrarchan English poetry, their high English Renaissance. They're everything that, many people would say that they would enjoy, would appreciate, would be excited by. And yet, despite being flawlessly edited, there they are, just sort of sitting on the margin and, outside, obviously specialists in the period. The great reading public hasn't quite ever realized he's there, which is I think is a very strange phenomenon.
Yes, that reminds me, Peter, of one of my tutors, the Marxist critic Jeremy Hawthorne, who taught Gerard Manley Hopkins. And I said to him once, but none of you don't believe in any of this, Jeremy. He said, but look at the expression, look at how he writes this, look at, I don't have to accept it, he said. It's just so beautiful. Oh, gosh, I've got something. I've got from Celia Hatt. I'm just trying to get this. Yes, hello Celia. It's lovely to that you communicated with us. I hope you're well. Celia says, thank you for voicing some of this lovely, rarely heard poetry. Have you considered the influence of Bishop John Fisher's treatise on the penitential psalms published in 1508, which was hugely popular and influenced Thomas Wyatt, among others? Fisher makes much of the tears of Peter and the repentance of Mary Magdalene, and also treats the illness of sin, often in terms of humours, the tropes of heat, fire, water, etc.,
Yes,
seem to me possible seeds for later emblematic treatments?
What a lovely question. This is a question I'm going to answer by starting by what may seem with a little bit of an autobiographical diversion, but trust me, I'm with it. That when I was for many years in Aberdeen, one of the cities in Britain that most undeniably had a renaissance, there was a fully Erasmian reformation from within of the Catholic Diocese of Aberdeen in the very, very first years of the 16th century, a visionary Bishop, William Elphinston. Now, he did what Fisher was trying to do in Rochester, but the really interesting thing is the devotional literature that he produced in connection with this kind of reform from within is speaking very much to Fisher, and it's speaking to that kind of effective devotio moderna that so clearly then has the richest afterlife in the corpus of material that we're looking at. And one of the things that I have set myself is the thought of looking back as well as forward. I mean, that is a wonderful question. One of the paintings we have at Campion Hall is a flagellation of Christ, an intensely realized vision by Palma il Vecchio, painted in 1528. And that's a painting that always seems to me to be on that pivot between that spirituality of the opening of the century that I think we could agree broadly comes out of Devotio Moderna, and then is looking forward to the meditative envisioning of the kind of spirituality that nourishes Saville. So a lovely question for which thank you very much. And yes, indeed, there is a continuum that I am, you might say, excitedly aware of.
Another question from Shannon Mulligan. Thank you, Shannon. Professor Davidson, many thanks for your St. Robert Southwell lecture. I am new to his poetry and linger by Southwell's self-imposed shape square in Christ's bloody sweat. More relating to emblematic work, were there images, woodcuts, engravings included with any of his published poems?
Fascinating. No, you might think there would be because, excellent question in context. Jesuits are some of the chief producers of illustrated emblem books. And when an English poet very much of the school of Saville, one generation down, Richard Crashaw, finally finds himself free, if you can put it that way, on the continent, that in the Paris edition of his works, the emblems which have been mute, which is to say unillustrated in the English edition, are all duly illustrated. But no, in fact, given the constraints of the circulation of Saville's work in manuscript within the Catholic community, these are actually hastily copied. They're very legible, but these are the plainest of plain manuscripts. What I can bring to this is that this is another question that just opens worlds for you. I hope I'm going to make myself clear. There survive from the mid-17th century a unique set of vestments designed and made by an English gentlewoman called Helena Winter for the Jesuit mission. There is no doubt that she was meditating on emblem texts, chiefly on Henry Hawkins's Parthenia Sacra, but there is also no doubt that she was using Saville's poems in her meditations, because we have, in fact, a chasuble that is to do with the martyrdom of Jesuit saints, and you have phoenix and pelican balanced, and amongst the flowers underneath are the rose campions that are on my college's arms, or on Campion Hall's arms as canting for Edmund Campion. So there is no doubt that you are absolutely right. We're in an emblem tradition. He's highly aware of the emblematic embroideries Mary Queen of Scots made. There were a couple of pieces of paper belonging to her French servants that seems to have had scribbles of some of her embroideries and brief notes of what was on some of the embroideries she made in captivity. And it is not impossible that Southwell could have known about those, but he certainly is extremely aware of that visionizing tradition in the emblem, and then fascinatingly, 2 generations down, meditating on his verse, including that one we've been talking about together. Helena Winter, one of the most notable English women artists of the early modern, makes this meditation textile, which has pelican and phoenix and rose campion. Lovely question. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Another question. John Hirsch. Hello, John. It's good to hear from you again. We know you well here in Oxford. Thank you for such a very interesting and thoughtful lecture. I wonder if part of Southwell's influence on Donne, and in particular on Herbert, may have been in reaction, seeking, with Herbert especially, to set aside the evident continental practices you documented, while also remaining responsive to the evident religiousness of Southwell's poetry.
Oh, what a lovely question. That's quite a complex question, John.
That's like a John Hirsch question.
I would say at once, but it would be what my friends would say I would say, that we have with Herbert 2 voices, because there is the Latin Herbert and the English Herbert. And I would say that the Latin Herbert is a pretty Baroque poet, pretty open to unmediated continental influence. I mean, I've written a little about this. I mean, he's very there with the kind of Jesuit poets who he's reading. I would say that it is fascinating. Something like Herbert's English Poetic preserves the richness of imagery, but it actually moves with Southwell in an extent that a lot of the poems in Southwell's canon are fairly directly expressed in English. And as I was saying to Michael at the beginning of this conversation, he uses popular English meter. He scorns not the least, as one of his poems says, and he's very happy to express himself sometimes in fairly straightforward diction and popular mode. So I think that we have a kind of double possibility for influence here, that Herbert's Latin work, I think, is open to the full riches and complexities, and that Herbert's English work has maybe learned something from particularly Southwell's songs, those poems towards the end of the sequence of his verses as published and as circulated. I think that is actually a very interesting idea. I mean, I'm increasingly convinced myself that Milton had access to one of Southwell's most elaborate Latin poems and had drawn on it quite extensively, but that's maybe something to talk about another time.
I was going to ask you a question about Milton, but Celia's come back to us, and she says, I have a vague memory of a mention, possibly by Alison Shell, of a Southwell manuscript containing a poem or fragment describing the flight of a hawk, and perhaps something that Hopkins might have seen or used in the Windover. Can you say anything about this, please?
Oh, I can't, I must say, immediately lay my mind on the poem in question, which absolutely does not mean that it's not there. There's a hawk and an eagle in one of the Marion poems. Yes, absolutely. Now, it's interesting about Hopkins and Southwell. So yes, first of all, thank you. Yes, I've got the hawk now. But Hopkins was, by and large, sitting around the fire in the evening in the room at Stonyhurst. This is through much of the middle of his career, actually the happiest years in many ways of his career. When he's at Stonyhurst College in Lancashire, he finds the surrounding landscape most beautiful, most conducive. He's working very, very happily in the college and in the college observatory, and he's observing natural phenomena, which he writes up most beautifully. This being said, Hopkins is aware of Southwell. He must have been sitting by the fire in the room next door to where Southwell's what's called the autograph manuscript and the Waldegrave manuscript were, because there's Hopkins by the fire at the front, at the right-hand end of the front range of Stonyhurst, and then if the safe's still in the same place, they're in the tower 2 rooms along. Very oddly, Hopkins only mentions Southwell once, and he's writing, I think, to one of his Protestant friends and says, well, of course, there are no Jesuit poets really except Southwell. And you know, I don't suppose anyone reads him now, sort of. He says something very, nothing against Southwell, but he just says, oh, I don't know about Jesuit poets. Oh, yes, of course, there's Southwell. But it seems to me that he's maybe tuning what he's saying to his correspondent. But I mean, certainly, you know, he was there with the Southwell material. And there's the St. Omer edition of Southwell 1620 is in that library. You know, everything you could want is in that library for the study of Southwell at that point. I mean, for evidences for Southwell's verse. And he does have this slightly disclaiming, I think it's a letter to his friend Dixon, and he's slightly sort of standing back.
I could just say something to Celia on that. I was once at St. Benos near St. Asaph, where, of course, Hopkins spent quite a bit of time and wrote many of his poems. And as I went in, the vice principal said to me, Professor Scott, you must come, you must come. She said, and she took me to a window. She said, you'll never guess what I've been seeing. And I said, no, what is it? She said, I've seen the window over the valley.
Oh, lovely.
That was rather beautiful. I think we're coming to our end, Peter, and I'm really sorry, because it's been such a lovely afternoon for us. I hope a lovely morning for people in America. So first of all, can I thank you, Peter Davidson, for such a stimulating and enjoyable paper. Can I remind everyone that the next talk in this series will be on the 10th of November, when Professor Michael Collins from Georgetown will actually be talking about Gerard Manley Hopkins. So that's one to look forward to. Other talks this term will be by Molly Clark on the 24th of November and John Drakakis on the 8th of December. Could you please note that there's another Zoom special coming up, which will be on the 1st of December, when the Future of the Humanities Project teams up with Georgetown's Free Speech Project for a session on reinterpreting history within an evolving culture. And that's going to be really very, very interesting. And we already have Baroness Usha Prashar going to speak to us, and the Hungarian economist, Peter Rona. Thanks again to Peter Davidson, and also to my co-convener, Joseph Simmons. Thanks to all of you who have asked questions today. If there are any that haven't come through and we haven't been able to address, we will try to address them and email our answers to you. I'd also like to thank all those at Georgetown University who have made this happen, especially, of course, Yvonne Kwek, who is absolutely brilliant and in administering this for us over so many miles away, and Shiman Tong, who has been working to make the Zoom possible. Special thanks, of course, to Professor Catherine Temple at Georgetown University for her work, as she feeds questions to me. At Blackfriars, my thanks go to Dr. Richard Finn, the director of the Las Casas Institute, Dr. John O'Connor, the regent, and Kinga Rona-Gabner, administrator. At Georgetown, I would like to thank Dr. Jack DeGioia, the president, Dr. Tom Banshoff, vice president, global affairs, and Dr. Chris Chalenza, the dean of Georgetown College. Without their support, these Zoom programs, and indeed the whole projects, could not take place. So finally, my thanks to you for being part of the audience. Please join us on the 10th and then again on the 24th of November. And in the meantime, please take care in these really dark days and keep safe. I'm Mike Scott. Please follow me on Twitter at Mike Scott Prof. Thank you and goodbye.